Okay, so welcome again. Now we've just seen the anatomy of the heart. Where is it? The covering of the heart, the serous and the fibrous pericardium, the blood supply and the nervous supply of the pericardium. So let's go and discuss the heart itself. So as we have seen, this is the double self-adjusting suction and pressure pump. This is the pumping machine of the blood, and its size, of course, it is almost to your fist. If you clench your fist, then that is the size of your heart, unless you have the cardiovascular disease that is affecting the heart, then it can be either smaller or larger than that. But again, it has 4 chambers, which are the atria. We have 2, left and right, and then we have the ventricles, which are the left and right again. But again, let's begin with the external features. So the shape of the heart is regarded as the trapezoid, having the base and the apex, whereby the apex is made up of the left ventricle and is directed inferiorly and anteriorly to the left. But again, the base is almost made up of the left atrium with the smaller contribution of the right atria, and they are seated on the diaphragm. Alright, so the atria, these are demarcated from the ventricles externally by what we call the coronary sulcus, so the atrioventricular grooves. So we have 2 of them, one running from the left, one running on the right. So they begin from the anterior going posteriorly, then this they demarcate. So in these grooves, you have the blood vessels that are found within there, and they are the one that, now if you see the groove, now you know from here downward you have the ventricles, and from here upward you have the atria. Alright, so the left and right and the right ventricles are demarcated from each other by what we call the anterior and posterior interventricular sulci. If you want to mention one, so you have to say the anterior interventricular sulcus. So this is the groove running anteriorly on the anterior surface of the heart, demarcating the ventricle left from the right. And then posteriorly of the heart, on the posterior surface of the heart, you have this what we call the posterior interventricular sulcus. This demarcates on the posterior aspect the left and right ventricles. So this diagram is to show you the coronary sulci. So this, you can see there is a groove here between this is the right atria and this is the right ventricle. So you see the groove here running posteriorly and laterally and posteriorly. And again here on the other hand, you can see from the left side, you can see the grooves again running from the anterior going backward. So these are called the coronary sulci. And then here you can see another groove within which you see the blood vessels running, and this is called the anterior interventricular sulcus. On the posterior side, then you can see again, so this is the posterior view of the heart. You can see that the blood vessels are coming from the right side, and this from the left side. And then you can see another groove down here is called the posterior interventricular sulcus, and these are called coronary sulci. Very good. Now another diagram to show you this. So again here you can see this, the coronary sulcus running inferiorly and posteriorly, and then you have another sulcus down there on this side, and then anterior you can see this groove here again called the anterior interventricular sulcus, and then posterior you can see another groove posterior. So this just to show you the coronary sulci. This is just a groove within which you see these blood vessels, and then here you see another groove here. This is just a depression here running posterior. So this is the posterior view. So this is called the posterior interventricular sulcus, and this is called the coronary sulcus. Leave alone these blood vessels, we're going to discuss them shortly. So this is the left atria, this is the right atrium, and this is the posterior surface. Alright, so anteriorly, again, this is another diagram to show you the coronary sulcus. This is the right one, and this is the left one. And then here you see another groove here within which you can find these vessels, which are the the anterior descending and the great cardiac vein, you're going to see them. So they run through this anterior interventricular sulcus. So the heart has its borders, and then we have the right, the left, the inferior and superior borders. So the right border, this is mainly made up of the right atria extending between the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So this just to show you. Let's begin with this image. So this is the border. This is called the superior border of the heart. The superior border of the heart. This is the right border of the heart. And then this one is called the inferior border. And this one is called the left border. So the left border is primarily made up of what? This is the left ventricle and part of the left atria. Superiorly, you can see it's made up of the great vessels, the ascending great vessels, and you can see where the great vessels emerge. But again, the right one is primarily made up of the right atria, and then the beginning or the end of these great vessels, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So inferiorly, the inferior border is primarily made up of the right atrium. Yes, this is primarily made up of the right atrium. So as we have seen here, the right one, the right border is the right atrium extending from between the superior and the inferior vena cava, and then the inferior border mainly by the right ventricle and slightly some of the part of the left ventricle. And then the left border is primarily made up of the left ventricle and slightly part of the left atria, specifically the auricle. And then superiorly, this is formed by the right and left atria, the auricles, and the ascending pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So from this border, the superior vena cava enters into the right atria. Alright, so let us go and a little bit enter inside and see what are the layers of that make the heart walls. And now, so the wall of the heart consists of 3 layers. These are the epicardium. The epicardium is primarily made up of the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. And then inner to the pericardium, to the epicardium, you're going to see the myocardium. So this is the middle layer of the heart, and the endocardium forms the inner layer. So the epicardium composed of 2 tissue layers, and these are the outermost one is visceral layer of the serous pericardium, and the inner one, it is made up of the adipose tissue and fibroelastic tissues, which now within the adipose tissue or the epicardial fat, you find the blood vessels run through or within the adipose tissue. But now see, this is physiologically it's normal to have the epicardial fat, but now sometimes in some people with the high levels of cholesterol in their body, then you can find a lot of fat deposits on the heart. So you have a variable quantity of the adipose tissue around or surrounding the heart, but normally you have a limited amount of the fat or the epicardial fat. Yeah, so in excess, then that it will be pathologic. Alright, so the epicardium contains the blood vessels, lymphatics, and the vessels that supplies the myocardium. So now see, in this image here, you see this is a little bit excess. This is not a normal, and this one you see, this is just a normal epicardial fat that is just beneath the visceral part of the serous pericardium. Alright, so the myocardium is responsible for pumping blood, and this makes approximately about 95% of the heart wall. And the inner one, the innermost layer of the heart wall, is the endocardium. This is the thin layer of the endothelium lying within the heart cavity. This is the one that lines the walls or the cavities of the heart, or the chambers of the heart, and it provides the smooth lining for the chambers of the heart, and it covers the valves of the heart as well. But again, now see, it is continuous with the endothelial lining of the blood vessels. So here again, you come back to the previous diagram. This fibrous pericardium, the visceral, this now the serous pericardium, which has the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium. Between them you have a space called the pericardial cavity, and now just inner to the serous pericardium you find the fibroelastic and fatty deposits, within which you find the blood vessels, nerves and the lymphatics, and then just beneath it you have these the walls of the muscles of the heart. So these muscles of the heart, the bulkiness varies from place to place. For instance, here you see there is a maximum bulkiness, and then on the left side, the heart muscles, they are too much than on the right side. But again, in the inner layer, you find this endocardium, which is the endothelial lining of the cavities within the heart, and then they even cover the valves. And of course, it is the continuation of the endothelial lining of the blood vessels. All right, so having seen the walls of the heart, let us see what are the blood supply to the heart wall. So the blood supply, essentially here, we have the arterial and venous blood supply, whereby the arteries supply to the heart walls or the muscles of the heart, and then the veins, they drain blood back to the heart itself for pumping to the lungs, and the blood vessel that carries the deoxygenated blood from the heart walls back to the heart for the transportation or the pumping to the lungs for the oxygenation. These vessels are called the coronary arteries. These supply the heart wall, and then you have the coronary sinuses. This drain the blood from the heart wall. So we have two coronary arteries. These are the left and right coronary arteries, and these are coming from what we call the aortic sinus. Aortic sinus. So there is a badging as they are sending out an image from the heart. It gives a badging. So from those badging you have two blood vessels image. Then they just image just superior to the aortic valves, and then they go through the atrioventricular groove or the coronary sulci, whereby the left coronary artery will immediately divide into circumflex coronary artery and the anterior descending, or what we call the anterior interventricular artery. So these two blood vessels, one will run into through the anterior interventricular groove. I hope you remember that. And then the circumflex will run through the coronary sulcus, and then it will go backward and posteriorly. It runs it runs around the heart through the coronary sulcus, and then it terminates posteriorly. But again, the anterior descending, it will run through the anterior coronary sulcus. All right, so the right one will give several branches, including the sinoarterial nodal branch, the right marginal artery, and some other branches again to supply the anterior ventricle. But again, it will terminate posteriorly by giving this what we call the posterior descending or the posterior interventricular branch. But again, this is in some people whereby the right coronary artery ends as the posterior descending, but in about 15% of people, it is the posterior descending branch. It comes from the lefty, from the circumflex coronary artery, which is the branch of the lefty coronary artery. So we're going to see that what we call the coronary dominance. All right, so let's see this in a normal circumstance. This is the left coronary artery, this is the right coronary artery. Immediately as the right coronary artery emerge from the aortic sinus, it will give a branch here to supply this area and supply the nodal or the sinoarterial node and some other areas here. And again, it will run through. So this right coronary artery will run through the coronary sulcus. It will go posteriorly, and then it will end as the posterior descending or the posterior interventricular branch. And then the left coronary artery will again now run through from the aortic sinus as the descending aorta. It gives a bulging here, and then in the artery image here. This is the left one. It will immediately divide into circumflex and the anterior interventricular branch. So the circumflex coronary artery will run around the heart and goes backward, whereby it will run through the left coronary sulcus, and then it will give several branches posteriorly, and then the anterior one, the anterior interventricular artery, will run through the anterior interventricular sulcus and give several branches to supply the left ventricle and the anterior surface of the right ventricle, and then it will go downward there at the apex, whereby it will form anastomosis from the blood vessel coming from the posterior or the posterior descending artery, and then that anastomosis will supply the apex of the heart. Alright, so the right coronary artery, again, let's go back here, will give this arterial node branch, and then these anterior ventricular branches, and then it will give this another big branch here, so the so-called the marginal branch, and then it will continue through the right coronary sulcus down and posteriorly, and it will give the terminal branch, the so-called the posterior descending artery. So this is another diagram to show you the branches given out from the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery, the circumflex and the anterior descending from the left coronary artery. And then here you can see from the posterior view, this is the circumflex branch. It will give several branches, including this one. So this is the left side, this is the right side. So this one is called the left marginal coronary arteries. This is the branch of the circumflex branch of the left coronary artery. Now you can see it will terminate by just giving several branches to supply the left ventricle. But now on the right side, it will give the marginal branch, and then it will descend and terminate as the posterior descending interventricular artery. But now see, this is only for the right coronary dominance artery people. But when we have this, what we call the dominances, now in other people you find about 70% of people, it is the right coronary artery that will give what we call the posterior descending artery. About 65 to 70% of people, it is this right coronary artery that will give the posterior descending artery. But in some people, about 15% to 18%, it is the left coronary artery through the circumflex branch. It will end up by giving the posterior descending. So for instance, look at this diagram here closely. This is the right coronary artery, and then you see it has ended up by giving the posterior descending. But this one, it is the left coronary artery, circumflex coronary artery, giving the left marginal circumflex, the marginal branch, giving some other several branches, but it ended by giving the posterior descending artery. So this, if a person have the heart with the posterior descending artery as the terminal branch of the circumflex branch of the left coronary artery, we call them the left coronary dominance. In such people with the posterior descending artery coming from the right coronary artery, we call them the right coronary dominance. Alright, so venous drainage, this is very important, but it's very simple again to remember, because they drain all the chambers or all the walls of the heart, and then eventually they will end by draining into the coronary sinus. So this coronary sinus, this is the main vein of the heart, whereby several tributaries they drain into it. Now, so some of the tributaries which are known, of course, now you have to remember one thing here. The branching of the blood vessels supplying the heart wall, including the coronary arteries and the veins, sometimes they are variable from people to people, and some of the blood vessels are not even named. In some book we find them named, in some of the book you can find them not named. For instance, in some of the images that I just showed you here, for instance, this one, you can see this coronary artery, you see here, this arterial nodal branch, but these ones are not named. But you see this one is a little bit at least named here as the marginal branch. But now see, this image here doesn't have such kind of blood vessel. There's no arterial nodal branch. And some of the images again, I just showed you, for instance, this one, you see no any blood vessel that is named here, but again you only can see this one. So some book they define naming or labeling of the blood vessel, but we have to remember those what we have just discussed. All right, so the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus, this as I just said, this is the short and very wide branch, the blood vessel that drains the blood into the right atrium. So it opens into right atrium, and it has several tributaries. These are the great cardiac vein, small cardiac vein, middle cardiac vein, and oblique cardiac vein. But again, some other cardiac veins, some other veins which drain several parts of the heart wall, drain into the coronary sinus. But now we're going to see these four: the great cardiac vein, oblique, middle, and small cardiac vein. But again, you have on the anterior surface of the right ventricle, you have this what we call the anterior cardiac vein. They drain directly into the right atrium. But again, you have these other smaller blood vessels. For instance, these are called the venae cordis minimi, or the Thebacean veins. These lie just in the substance of the walls of the heart, and they drain directly into the chambers they drain into. For instance, if they drain from the right atria, they will drain into the chamber of the right atria, and if they drain from the ventricle, they will drain into the same ventricle again. All right, so let's see these blood vessels. So this is the anterior vein, cardiac vein. They drain directly into the right atria. And then these ones are the oblique. This one drains the left atria. Then you have the great cardiac vein. And then this is called the small cardiac vein. This is called the middle cardiac vein. So these are the main one. The small cardiac vein draining the right atria. The middle cardiac vein draining the posterior interventricular septum, or the posterior interventricular groove, draining the posterior aspect of these two chambers, the right and left ventricle. And then you have this oblique draining the left atria. Then you have the great cardiac vein that drains the anterior, this one, anterior interventricular groove, taking blood from the left and right ventricle on the anterior aspect. Then it runs through the coronary sulcus, the left coronary sulcus, with the circumflex coronary branch of the left coronary artery, and then it goes backward there, and then through the coronary sulcus again. You can see this one comes here, and then it will join the coronary sinus. So this is the coronary sinus, whereby you have the great cardiac vein with its branches. For instance, this one, if this was the marginal branch of the circumflex coronary branch of the left coronary artery, so this is called the posterior ventricular vein, or the vein of the posterior, or the posterior vein of left ventricle. So it joins the great cardiac vein, and then they drain into the coronary sinus. As I said, some of the blood vessels branches are not named in some books. So here, this is the nutshell. This is the small cardiac vein, the great cardiac vein, and then you can see this other unnamed one from the left ventricle. But now please remember the middle cardiac vein. So essentially, you have the oblique from the left atria, then you have the great cardiac vein, and then you have the middle cardiac vein and the small cardiac vein. So these are the venous drainage of the heart. Alright, so we have just seen the coronary supply of the heart. The next session, we are going to see the internal features of the heart, and that will mark almost the end of today's session. Thank you.